Hi everyone and welcome to the first episode of Let's Talk History. Now, because it is a year since I was officially awarded my Masters, thanks Facebook for reminding me, I've decided that today's topic will be the one that I focus on for my dissertation, with a few extra bits thrown in, which will be France, Britain, the Middle East and the post-war settlements and agreements. Now, this video/episode will look at how they got there, all the conflicting discussions and announcements and agreements which came before it, and the fallout that's come from that, or proposed fallout. Now, I'm only looking at 1915 to 1920 because try to keep the videos kind of short and watchable. I could go on for quite a long time about this, however, I will not. I may split it up into several parts. Now, starting off with the first of the agreements, probably the least well known, kind of falls into the background with what comes next. However, it was important and I found it very interesting in my research, so we're going to talk about it, which was the Bunsen Committee. Now, the Bunsen Committee was headed up by a diplomat called Maurice de Bunsen. Now, despite his name being on the committee, it was another member of the committee who seemed to take a leading role, and someone whose name will come up later on in the video, which was Sir Mark Sykes. Now, Sir Mark Sykes was Lord Kitchener's representative on the committee, alongside other members of the government from areas such as the Treasury, the Admiralty, the War Office, Colonial Office, etc. Now, Lord Kitchener is a name that may or may not be familiar to people. They'll know his face if you've ever seen the World War I recruitment posters. That's Lord Kitchener's face that's on that. Now, the Bunsen Committee met in 1915 when a successful conclusion to the First World War was far from certain. However, what they were discussing was what was the future of what would then be the former Ottoman Empire should Britain and her allies be successful in the First World War. Now, they come up with four possible outcomes for the future of the former Ottoman Empire, and decided to take just one of them forward. Now, the one that they decided to take forward was the idea that the former Ottoman Empire would be split into five historical and ethnographic elates, or provinces. Now, they would be known as the provinces of Anatolia, Armenia, Syria, Palestine, and Iraq Jizra. Now, they saw it as an idea that if they could create, as I say, historical and ethnographic areas which contained similar peoples, similar tribal elements and similar tribal people, then a top-down approach would be much easier to approach than, bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach which they previously had under the Ottoman Empire. Now, the other three they decided not to take forward was the idea that there would be an outright partition of the former Ottoman Empire, with spheres of influence given to Britain, France and Russia, who at the time were still fighting with Britain and France against the Ottoman Empire, which would change in 1917, which would actually have a knock-on impact with something else, which we'll talk about later in the video. That, of course, didn't happen per se. However, again, we'll come on to how there was some slight truth to that idea. Thirdly, they considered the preservation of the Ottoman Empire with a preservation of the Ottoman Empire with a small state sort of left in Anatolia. So instead of spheres of influence controlled by Britain, France and Russia, we're a partition of the former Ottoman Empire with a small state left in Anatolia, and fourthly, was allowing the Ottoman Empire to remain as an independent state rather than an empire of a collection of states, but it would relocate the caliphate from Istanbul to Damascus. And although, as I said, that is not the solution that they went for. In the end, they went for the first one I pointed out there. Now, this was in 1915, as I say. However, in 1915, there was also the beginnings of something which would essentially put the Bunsen Committee into the background, which was the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence. Now, the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence was letters essentially written between Sir Henry McMahon, another British diplomat, and Sharif Hussein, who was the head of the Hashemite family, and the Hashemites were one of the most respected and highest families in the Middle East at the time. Now, the Hashemites viewed with favour a phrase which will become more relevant later on again, the establishment of an independent Arab state in the former Ottoman lands, and they were willing to work with the British, fight with the British, and help the British fight the Ottoman Empire and defeat the Ottoman Empire in return for an independent Arab state. Now, at first, the British were unresponsive to that. However, following the landings at Gallipoli and the aftermath of that, the British became more receptive to the idea of Arab help. That was in response to a plea from one of Sharif Hussein's sons, Abdullah, who would become again a ruler in the Middle East later on. And however, we will focus more on his son, his brother, Abdullah's brother, Sharif Hussein's other son, Faisal, a lot more in this video, for reasons which will become apparent. Now, the original idea for the independent Arab state, which Sharif Hussein was proposing, would incorporate Syria, modern day Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states. Now, this demand became known as the Damascus Protocol, which, as you can see, did incorporate all the main areas of what we'd consider today to be the modern Middle East. Now, this was not accepted by the British or by Sir Henry McMahon in any great or clear way. Sir Henry McMahon was very aloof and very vague in his responses, saying what he could to keep him on side. Now, eventually, he managed to convince Sharif Hussein that enough was being done to persuade him that it would be considered in the future that if he rose his troops. And under Faisal, as I've just mentioned, Sharif Hussein's son, the Arab revolt was begun in 1916. So the Arab tribes and many of the Arab peoples really rose up against the Ottoman Empire on the side of the British. Now, one name which, if you've seen the film or you might have just known the name off the top of your head, Lawrence of Arabia, that was who he spent a lot of the war with. He was very much friends with Sharif Hussein and Faisal especially. He taught the Arab people, or the Arab army that was fighting alongside him, the sort of guerrilla tactics of blowing up railways, and they helped win really strategic areas of the Middle East like Acre and other areas later on. Now, they were at the end of the war the first people into Damascus, something that would be short-lived, as the French would debate who was in charge of Syria and who had the right to control Syria. Now, while the Arabs were fighting with the British in order to gain control of a future independent Arab state, two diplomats, one from Britain, one from France, were meeting. Sir Mark Sykes, who we mentioned earlier, and Georges Picot from France, met and looked at a map of the Middle East and areas of the soon to be former Ottoman Empire, along with counterparts from Italy and Russia, and decided who would get what. Now, this wasn't a straightforward conversation. It wasn't as simple as everyone agreeing. There was some great debate over areas in Mesopotamia, which is modern day Iraq, and Palestine and Jerusalem, and who and what would control that. Now, Mosul, which is an oil-rich region of, at the time, Mesopotamia, would later be part of Iraq, was originally under the French sphere of influence under Sykes-Picot. Now, under Sykes-Picot, there was, as you can see quite clearly, a sort of quite a bit there that was kind of split between sort of Italy, France, Britain, and Russia. Now, as you can see, Russian control was mainly in eastern Turkey, kind of out towards the border. Italian control was down into southern Turkey. A wee bit of Russian control over in the northwest, with French control and British control mainly focused on what we would consider the Middle East. Now, as you can see, French control kind of takes in Lebanon, bits of Turkey, Syria, and into modern day Iraq and Mosul at the time, with Britain getting parts of Palestine, which was the coastal area of Haifa, bits of Jordan and Iraq towards the Persian Gulf. Now, the Persian Gulf was much more interesting to the British at the time, which is why they were more willing to negotiate Mosul than perhaps would be imagined for an oil-rich region. Now, we'll look at Sykes-Picot as we are just now. We'll look at the San Remo Conference, which was the conferences at the end of World War One, at the end of the First World War, I should say, that decided where the mandates would be set, and Mosul would fall under British control in the final mandate, alongside all of Palestine and modern day Israel as well, and that includes Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem, under the original plans, was going to fall under international control, with not one country alone controlling it. That was to keep everyone on side. Now, Sykes-Picot was actually a secret agreement made between the powers at the time. However, as I said, Russia was an ally at the time, headed by the Tsar. However, following the Bolshevik Revolution and the withdrawal of Russia from the war, this agreement was exposed to the public. Now, this, of course, given that the whole point of the Arab revolt and the Arab army fighting on behalf of the British was to get an independent Arab state, this threw the whole relationship into disrepute. However, it was once again dealt with by sort of vague promises, vague sort of denials, and the idea that this was not necessarily where the future was going to go. It was mainly one discussion that was being held. However, this was exposed in October of 1917. In November of 1917, the Balfour Declaration was announced. Now, the Balfour Declaration was named for Arthur James Balfour, former Prime Minister of the UK, and he would write to Lord Rothschild a letter which is 67 words, and it would set in motion the next 30 years of British foreign policy in Palestine, and then it would be the words that many people to this day still point to as a major factor and a beginning of the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that we've seen for the last 100 years or so. Now, I'll read it to you, and I'll also put it up on the screen here. So it says, His Majesty's Government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Now, Britain at that time had no right to promise anything to anyone. Jerusalem was going to be under international control, and only a small part of what would be Palestine was going to be in British control. So it's very much viewed as, and was once described as by a journalist called Arthur Koestler, probably butchering his name, but he said that this agreement, or this declaration, was equivalent of one nation solemnly promised to a second nation the country of a third. And the Balfour Declaration would become a matter of great debate. However, it would become embedded in the mandate for Palestine. Again, we'll see later that Britain eventually got full control of Palestine and what would become the future state of Israel as well. And this mandate, this declaration, I should say, sorry, was embedded in the mandate. Now, it was also embedded in the agreement between Chaim Weizmann, and who was the head of the Zionist organisation, and Faisal, again, Sharif Hussein's son. And Faisal signed it on the caveat that he was happy to have the Jewish homeland, however, it would be a Jewish homeland within the independent Arab state. He did not agree to a Jewish state or a Jewish homeland within Palestine per se. He also didn't read English, which the declaration was written in, so he wrote that caveat, he signed that based on the caveat and the fact that he couldn't actually read what the information said. Now, I did mention there that Faisal was the first into Damascus with Lawrence of Arabia. Now, he would declare himself king of Syria, and Damascus would bring the seat of his power. However, the French disagreed, and in July of 1920, would overthrow Faisal as king, force him into exile, and declare French rule. And that would be confirmed at San Remo, with the establishment of the mandates for Lebanon and Syria, which would go to France, and the mandates of Iraq and Palestine, which would go to Britain. Now, Faisal's time in the history does not end here. As a sort of backup, let's call it, or a sort of thank you, I guess, from the British perhaps, or maybe they saw it as a way to keep control in Iraq. They made Faisal king of Iraq. Now, that would be a tumultuous episode, which I could do a whole episode on again, so I'll leave it there for now. But Faisal becomes king of Iraq while it's under British rule for in the interim until the 1930s. Now, the mandates actually last into the 1940s and into the 1950s as well. Now, the French mandates for Syria lasted until 1958, and the Lebanon one had to come to an end just post World War II in 1946. Now, British mandate in Transjordan, which it was known as until 1949 when it became just Jordan, lasted until 1946, and then they changed their name in 1949. And of course, the mandate for Palestine comes to an end in 1948, ushering in the establishment of the State of Israel, and the conflict which followed from that within the Middle East has since then. Now, what I'll post up now is the breakdown of the mandates. Now, as you can see, as I say, the San Remo Conference, by set in motion by the League of Nations, awarded these areas to Britain. Now, so they got the mandates for Palestine, Transjordan and Iraq, and France got the mandates for Syria and Lebanon. So I'll post them up together. As you can see, there's a sort of contrast between Sykes-Picot and San Remo. You can see how much control was similar or different. Now, you can see there that Britain gets a larger chunk of the pie per se. It gets all of Palestine, it gets a lot more of Iraq, and it goes across into all of Transjordan/Jordan. So I hope that gives you an idea of Britain, France, and the Middle East post First World War. It's a subject which I found massively fascinating. I thought it was very interesting. I didn't have any background in it when I started. I think it was like third year at university, and we started talking about the Middle East, and it's always sort of fascinating me. I think it's something that we don't really think about. We're aware of the Middle East, we're aware of the conflict that goes on there, but I think we're really aware of the sort of background to it and where it's come from. Now, there's a lot of debate about the impact of Sykes-Picot, the impact of Balfour, and the drawing of the modern day borders by the major powers after the war. That's an interesting thing to think about for yourselves. There's plenty of reading material out there. There's plenty of articles, journals, books, websites, documentaries which you can have a look at. Definitely check them out and have a wee think about it. Just think, like, the Middle East has such a rich history going back to the establishment of the first caliphate, the establishment of Islam, moving across right across North Africa up into Spain, the fight against the Khan dynasty, the overthrow of the Ottomans, the golden age of Baghdad, up until 1258. There's a massive rich history in the Middle East, which I think a lot of us ignore. But I hope that you've enjoyed today. I hope you've stuck around for the 20 minutes that the video is taken to film, and I hope that you enjoy it. Cheers.